Welcome, everyone, to the Volunteer and Combination Officer section special edition webinar. I call it special edition because it's on a Thursday instead of most of our webinars are on Tuesday. But this is a critical topic that the VCOS believes is something that the fire service need to become more aware of and use in the decision making process of helping their fire department live in the next century. So we're going to talk about thinking critically about adapting challenges, how the key to a chief officer's success. But before we do that, there's a couple political things I got to take care of. We are using audio, voice over IP, so you don't have to worry about, or you have to use a phone line. But if for whatever reason the screen freezes up, log out, log back in. More than likely, you'll be back in, no problem. Uh, we do want you to sign into the chat session and let us know who's here. And if you have questions or comments like that in the chat, we will be monitoring that during the presentation. So use that. You can use the question and answer section, but most people just use the chat session. And if we want it, we'll load some handouts up so that you can see what's out there as we have found out about critical thinking. The VCOS has many things that are going on. I'm not going to read you all the things that are there on the slide, but suffice it to say that the VCOS is extremely busy. We hope we're doing the things that you, the local fire official, need done. And so if you don't think we're doing what you need, I encourage you to let us know. And we will certainly look into maybe doing something kind of program that you're interested in. We do webinar series, like I said, every week. We do ribbon reports. Encourage you to go to the vcos.org website, whether you're a member or not. We obviously do like for you to become a member, but if you're not, you can download all of our reports free. And so there are several reports that have been used for many years that are being updated, and we have a new one that's coming out. Will not be early of 2024, will be early of 2025 on the use of data. So this is a partnership that the VCOS has with Vector Solutions. Vector Solutions awards a training award to members that presented at Fire Rescue International, which gets you a trip to Fire Rescue International and gets you access to their program. But Vector Solutions shares the same mission as the IFC, and that is keeping firefighters safe and effective when called into action. With that in mind, Vector Solutions is focused on providing the fire service with the ultimate tools for training and operations management. That's why Vector Solutions is making industry-leading training platform available and more affordable for volunteer agencies. They are excited to share an exclusive offer for VCOS members. If you're looking to upgrade your training program but have a limited budget to make it happen, now's the time to demo Target Solutions. With 10% off and no setup fees, this is the ultimate price on the ultimate training management system. Contact Vector Solution online at vectorSolutions.com/iafc.vcos.exclusive.offer or call them today at 1-800-840-8048. I'd say that number again because that'd be the easiest way to talk to them is 1-800-840-8048. But the VCOS encourages you to help our partners help you do a better training program. This topic is a topic the VCOS has had on their, I'll say, on the agenda for about a year. And we have several members here today that are really they're the key to helping us get this education program developed. Got Chief Al Yancey from Manuka, Illinois, is with us. Kevin McGee, Fire Chief retired. He's not really retired. He's interim Fire Chief in Waco, and he was the Fire Chief in Prince William County, Maryland. And then we got the Deputy Chief of Spring, Texas, Landon Churchill, who took time out from damage assessment to come on the webinar with us today. And last but by no means least, we have least is Dr. Kate Markey. And she is our resident expert on critical thinking, and she's helping us get this program going. So I will turn that over to Kate. It's all yours, Kate.
Thanks so much, Chief Buckman. And I will offer one correction. I know that there are a lot of folks in the fire service who look to their subject matter experts, expect us to have the same credentials that you do. I am not actually a doctor. I have a master's degree in international affairs, but I've spent a lot of my career thinking about critical thinking in national security and in the public safety sphere. So I hope some of the ideas I have to share with you today will be relevant as we go forward. So thanks to everyone who's joined. We're going to have Landon monitor the chat as we go for any questions that you want to throw out or comments you want to offer. There are three major things, two main learning objectives, and one idea I invite you to hold in mind as we move through this seminar today. One item that we're going to spend quite a bit of our time on is talking about systems, and we'll characterize some as complicated and some as complex. And so we'll spend a bunch of time talking about those, defining those terms and talking about why those concepts can matter to us as leaders and problem solvers. We're going to focus on complex systems and thinking about the features they have that can pose specific types of problems that are sometimes very counterintuitive when it comes to problem solving. So we'll take, like I say, a lot of our time is going to go to that. We will have a pause at a certain point to let everyone think about how this complicated versus complex idea shows up in your life. And then we'll turn to how complicated and complex systems pose, like I said, different kinds of problems that we need to respond to. And we'll think about how systems thinking, this approach to thinking about the whole of our problem, can help us as leaders and thinkers. So I'm inclined to ask whether, if you already know if you're familiar with systems thinking, or if you are new, if you can let us know that in the chat, that can help me make sure that we're using the right amount of time on the right things. Because here's the deal. We know the webinars often are scheduled for 60 minutes. We've asked for 90 today because we plan to cover a lot of content. And part of that is because I find a lot of it just super exciting. But it's often new, the vocabulary to talk about the concepts as themselves and then to think about how they actually matter in life. I find that generally takes a little bit over an hour. Roll with the flow. We're going to throw a lot at you. If this is new content, super. Thanks, Ryan. If it's new content for you, let us know if you want us to pause for a minute so you can take in new concepts. But also, I promise you don't have to grasp everything 100%. There is no test at the end of this webinar. And if there's any part of it that doesn't feel relevant to you in your life immediately, I encourage you to park it, not worry about it, and then we can come back to it at the end of the session if it's turning out that there's more questions you want to ask about that. Awesome. Yep, with a bunch of folks who are new, we will, I hope, offer you some pretty exciting ideas. So let's dive in. Because a lot of us, again, I'm thrilled we have some new folks here. A core word that turns out to be sometimes a little bit tricky is this notion of what even is a system. When we use this word all the time, but today we're going to try to use that word in a very particular way to talk about a set of things that become a system because they interact. On the left part of our slide, we have a bunch of dots. You can take them to be a bunch of people. 6, 7 people you know. If they're just out there standing on the street, they're not a system. Today, we're going to be thinking about them as a system when they begin to actually interact with each other in ways that make them a whole. And that will become, I hope, it's more and more clear as we move along. When we think about what matters, when we evaluate what kind of systems we're looking at and what they mean to us, we're going to talk today about 5 elements of a system that can help us think about how we want to respond to them when we live in those systems or need to lead those systems. And what we're going to talk about in particular are how many things are in a system, how many components are there, and what kind of interconnections are there between those components? How many of them are there? Are they bidirectional, unidirectional, richly connected or not? We're also going to care about the diversity of components in a system. Well, there are a lot of different kinds of things that are happening in the system or that are parts of the system. And we're going to care a lot about adaptation. Can any of the components of a system change what they are? Can any of the interactions change the way they work? Can the system itself as a whole change what it is or what it does? That's going to matter a lot. And the way that we see these things play out is in what kind of forces control what the components of a system do or the system as a whole does. Where does control come from? And that will have significant impacts on how predictable the actions of the components of a system are, or how predictable the system itself is over time. So we're going to move in to talk about each of those things in particular when we look at a complicated system or a complex system. So here's a chance to put those words in context. I do find it helpful. Like I said earlier, we're going to mainly focus on complex systems, but it often is useful to learn about what that is by comparing it to a different kind of system. So before we really dive into complexity, we'll set a baseline for complicated systems. In these kinds of systems, there are not that many components. There's only a few, or there's a very manageable number. And the way that they interconnect is straightforward. The interconnections are set up to do one thing. We understand what they do. We understand where there are connections and what their purpose is. And there may be very low diversity or a very purposeful. If there is diversity in the system, it's to a specific reason. For example, a lot of mechanical systems are really great illustrations of a complicated system. And one that a lot of folks turn to when we talk about what a complicated system is like the brake system on a car. I am not a mechanic, so bear with me while I offer this example. But when you look at a brake system, an expert mechanic knows exactly what kind of pieces are supposed to be in the system. There is a lever that is the brake pedal. It connects to some hydraulic lines that have brake fluid in them. Those go ahead and compress some elements that the mechanic knows what the name of is. Eventually, we're going to get the pads are going to close around my rotating wheel. A mechanic knows all the things that need to be in a brake system. And a mechanic knows exactly the way they are supposed to interact with each other, what's supposed to touch each other and what is not. And they don't change. There's no adaptation in this system. The brake pads don't become ice cream cones because they feel like it. The hydraulic fluid doesn't become steam if it's working right? If a brake system is going to do what it does, there is a set list of components that interact in exactly one way. There is nothing in there that isn't in the brake system. And there's no part of it that is going to stop being a component of the brake system and become a bouquet of flowers. So what this means is that when we think about what's controlling this system, the way it is constructed allows the parts to obey certain laws. And in this case, in a mechanical system, the laws of physics apply, right? The rules about how friction works makes the effect of the system be to slow your vehicle when you depress the brake lever. And if you had, and there's a clear cause and effect relationship. Let's go to this last point here. When you are expert in the system, you know exactly what part of the system generates the effect. And you know that the system is always going to have the one clear effect. And when you look at a brake system, for example, when you tell a mechanic, it's making a weird noise today, the mechanic can have a really clear sense of what part is likely broken. Or if you say it's slowing, it's braking really fast today, or it's braking really slow, and the mechanic has a good sense of where to look for what's going on with that, right? So we have a very manageable, clearly understood set of components that interact to do one thing, and they do that in just one way. And everyone knows how it's supposed to work. So that's the baseline when we're thinking about what a complicated system is. And so far, no one has put a stop, wait in the chat. So we'll carry on to our next point in this journey, which is to compare that then to a complex system where there might be quite a few more components, many more components. And importantly, the interconnections that they have are much more richly interwoven. The components of a complex system may have a lot of different touch points in the system. And there may be components coming in and out of the system that come from very different places or originally have very different purposes. Ecosystems. I don't know how many of you have kids in school are learning a lot about complexity because they learn about ecology. But you can have a species move into an area and it just fits right in. And now there's this new element that didn't used to be in the system, but now it is. So diversity and adaptation are rich in complex systems. And when we look at an ecosystem, you might have evolution where a thing that used to be a predator now starts to be an omnivore in any case. We'll come to some more examples that are a little bit closer to the fire service. What's key to take away here is that there is no central governing force that clearly defines all the things that a complex system is going to do, or that dictates to the components of that system how they should behave. The fancy term in the literature for this is that the system is self-governing, that the actions of the components themselves make the system do what it does. And this means that it can be very difficult to see where the causes of any kind of output actually come from. And here too, I'm seeing no, wait, stop in the chat. There's one more slide I want to cover before we do a little bit of a knowledge check on this. It'll talk more about what that lack of cause and effect relationship actually looks like and how that relates to the components, interconnections, diversity, and adaptation in a system. To recap, if you look at your mechanical system, we're not thinking about adaptation or tons of change that's going to come out of nowhere. We're thinking about mainly just one purpose, one outcome. As we turn to complexity now for the rest of our conversation, think about where we get irregular outcomes or obscure cause and effect. And here are some illustrations of what that obscure cause and effect can look like. For those of you who do have, one of you talked about having a cursory knowledge of systems thinking, the word emergence comes out quite a bit now, even in the like Scientific American general coverage of complexity. It's this fancy word, and what it means is that when you look at a complex system, the whole may have behaviors or characteristics that don't seem connected in any way to what the components themselves really do. And people will use this phrase about it being more or different than the sum of its parts, that a complex system somehow is more or different than what its components actually do. And if you'll bear with a few more examples from outside the fire service, because they come up all the time and they're really great. They tend to be really, really useful teaching examples. I'm not a mechanic and I'm not a chemist, but in teaching about complexity and learning about complexity, I've learned enough about water to understand how it's a really cool example of what happens when you take a bunch of different components and make them into a system. One of my high school friends is a chemist, teaches chemistry, and he told me that we know a lot about a single water molecule. We know that each water molecule has 3 atoms. It's got 2 hydrogen atoms and an oxygen atom. And then we know that it's got a set of electrons, and we know which of the electrons are bonded and which of the electrons are free. And apparently, if you're a chemist, it's really cool that water molecules have polarity. Tons of things we know about that describe every single water molecule. But only when you take a lot of them and make them into an interconnected system is the system of those water molecules. The system is wet. No water molecule is wet. But when you take them and make a whole system of them, the system has this emergent property, this overall characteristic of wetness that is different than if you just took all the things. If you said, oh, we have 1,000 molecules, so we have 3,000 atoms and that many more electrons. No, there's a property that emerges from their connectedness. And the other example that comes up all the time when people talk about what complexity is ants. So If you do more reading on this, you will read more about ants. The big takeaway about how this relates to emergence is that the ants in an ant colony are dumb as bricks, right? They only have a few jobs and they don't think about what they're doing. They respond to chemicals in the environment, it sounds like, and some of them are going to turn out to be doing a job in a given day of caring for the eggs in the colony. And some of the ants are going to go out and do really complicated recon, right? And one ant is going to go out and look for food in one direction. Another ant goes out and looks for food in another. When one ant finds food, the whole colony homes in on that, right? And it's not like the queen ant wakes up in the morning and tells all of her workers, hey, worker 1, you're going to go in this direction, and worker 2, you're going to go in that direction, and workers 3, 5, 10, when you hear these other guys say they found food, go find them. No one tells those ants how they're supposed to spend their day. And yet the colony, when you take all the different ants together who do their jobs in their own little independent foraging or egg carrying way, when a predator comes, the whole colony converges to defend against the threat. So the emergent property of an ant colony, no single ant says, I want to be able to defend against an aphid. The emergent property of an ant colony is that it is coherent and fills the survival needs of all of the ants. And you can take this to the fire service or in any group of people you live with. People make complex systems. And if you take 5 of your firefighters, you know them really well, right? You've seen them all go through training. You've talked to each of them. You've interviewed them. You've hired them. You've gone through their performance reviews. You know them deeply well. And you might have 5 firefighters who are all awesome and they all want to do great work and they're motivated. But when you take a given set of them and put them on A shift, it's a little dysfunctional, right? You take a bunch of them and you put them in B shift. B shift is awesome. What is it that takes 5 individuals who are great by themselves and makes one group of them have the emergent property of friction or poor communication, right? And a different set of them have the emergent property of being awesome. Or you take 5 mediocre firefighters, you're like, I don't know how this is going to work. And you put them together and somehow they blossom, right? And they're the shift you want when things go pear-shaped. So that the label we can use for that is emergence, but that then takes us back to this notion of unpredictability, right? Even if you know a system super well, it may do something as a whole you aren't expecting. So this is a good time to pause because that was a lot. If your brain is not full, I'm guessing it was because it's full of something else that happened to you while you're sitting there watching the webinar. To recap, when we think about systems, we're going to think about how many components, how they're connected, how much diversity there is or adaptation there is in the components, the makeup of the system, and then thinking about whether the system has a really clear set of cause and effect relationships that are unchanging and always produce a predictable outcome, or whether you've got that phenomenon where knowing a lot about each of the components of the system isn't going to be able to help you know exactly what the system does. So this is a good place for a quick knowledge check, and I'll put this on to you all to take a minute and think of anything that you think you recognize in your life as a complicated or complex system. If you're game, name them in the chat. Like I said, I'll give you about a minute to think about this. And I'm looking at Michael's comment. Often when I talk about this, so I talk about complexity with people all the time. My friends will ask, hey, Kate, what you up to? And I'll say, oh, I've got this new class on complexity. And they'll say, I don't know what that is. Tell me about it. And I explain that we're talking about, you know a lot of things, you might know a bunch about your family. Say you love your family, you get in the car. Every time you go on a road trip, everything just erupts, right? I was talking with a friend who I hadn't seen in a long time, and I laid out all of this to him over dinner. He said, "It's family therapy." Marriage, exactly. Marriage is complex. And yeah, to Michael's comment, anything with humans, I think the difference, when we talk about what is a connection, like a mechanical connection versus what's a relationship, what has give and take, what do you just touch versus what do you influence? We'll talk in the next couple of slides about where that influence comes from. And yeah, Tyler, thanks. Among the things we've been talking about as we prep this webinar is that systems are nested, right? And so you might have a complex system. At the high level, a system might be itself complex, but components of it might be useful to treat as just complicated. And when we've been thinking about fire service examples on this point, Chief Yancey had talked earlier this week about thinking about a single car crash into a tree. We can conceive of that as complicated, right? There's one car, there's one tree. You know that the amount of force that was applied when they hit is going to shape how compacted the frame of the car is. And when you show up with for extrication, you know what kind of tools you need to use to open up the car door. Pretty straightforward. And it really is about force, impact, and physical effects on the car. But when you throw in the patience, and we got talking about, we can also see the same darn thing as complex when we talk about, it's like I was offering the example, and my mind immediately went to, and I'm laughing at myself about how it's totally complex because you've got, one of the patients is having a baby and the other is your partner and he wants to do a refusal so that you can take her to the hospital, and they're stressed out and they're yelling at your crew, and your crew maybe has got some, newbies on it, and they don't quite know how to manage the scene. Now this is not just a complicated problem anymore. And yes, when we do budget, never straightforward. And Landon had actually offered earlier too the notion of deployment. As complicated it can be if all you think about is moving pegs into holes, right? But when you've got a couple of people who are supposed to show up on shift, who are the specialists to run a particular apparatus, they don't come. Now your whole system completely collapses. So I am inclined to say we're grokking it, unless Landon, there's something else to add.
Can we just have one question in the Q&A about the Cynefin framework and how it relates to this, or if it does or if it doesn't? I loved your comments when we talked about it, so I wanted you to hit that.
Yeah. So if you do read more of this literature, you will definitely see, for those of you who haven't popped over into the Q&A tab, there's a, I'm not an expert on the Q&A tab. It's Cynefin. It's a really weird sounding word, but you will see this, and it comes up a lot in the leadership literature on complexity. Cynefin wants to put the distinction between complicated and complex onto a 2x2 axis, right? Where it's talking about whether you have a few or a lot of components, and clearly understood or ill understood relationships. And it can be a really handy way to offer shorthand. It can be a really handy shorthand for recognizing when you are in a complicated type of problem or a complex type of problem, but it also throws in the additional factor. And so this is where we're going to go technical for a minute. In the study of systems dynamics and of systems thinking, there is a spectrum from simple systems, which we didn't talk about today, but then complicated systems. And then there's complex, but also chaotic systems. Chaos, making a really short answer here to the excellent the excellent question. Chaos is related to, but a little bit different than complexity. And so my take on Cynefin is that it wants to presume a 2x2 when in fact we have sort of this weird misfit where chaos is partly complicated and partly complex. Chaos technically is deterministic. We do understand cause and effect in a chaotic system. And so if you end up finding that the content here that we're going to introduce from an author named Danella Meadows, or the really most complexity-oriented research, if you find that that's relevant to what you're doing, you might find that some of the frameworks you're going to want to work with don't quite jive with Cynefin. But for those of you who will see it in the leadership literature, amen. There are some really great pieces that people have written about how that relates to problem solving, which I think you should see as we carry on through the rest of the content. And thanks, yes, the spelling. Anything else before we move on? Because here's one more round of a ton of content we're going to throw at you. A bunch more words that I hope will really resonate when you think about the difference between setting up what looks like a complicated schedule when it becomes complex, when you're thinking about staffing, people showing up for their work or not, right? Or thinking about how you're going to get someone out of the regular routine and into special training, or someone gets injured, right? And suddenly your regular deployment schedule goes from being complicated to being complex. Or when you think about how marriage, like the day-to-day and the month-to-month and year-to-year arc of the relationships that build and change over time, I think you'll recognize some of these components in those systems. One of the core elements that is responsible in many ways for the obscurity, the difficulty in finding cause and effect in a complex system, is the notion that in a complex system, you're going to have feedback loops where one component or one phenomenon in the system causes a second, and the second also causes the first. And we can point to these, whether they do something that's beneficial or detrimental. We're going to call them vicious cycles if it's something where it's an effect overall that we don't prefer. But we also can talk about them being virtuous circles when we see them generate outputs that we're excited about. But fundamentally, we're also going to be looking to see whether a feedback loop creates continuous, escalating, increasing change, or whether the feedback loop ends up offering a balancing effect. And these will change how we respond to these systems as leaders and as we solve problems. And examples of a vicious cycle is vicious cycles themselves can be beneficial or harmful. When we look at continuing, runaway, escalating change, it can be a positive thing when you love working out. And so you go to the gym every day and you do really constructive workouts. And so you get stronger. And so it becomes, you get to do new exercises. And so it's even more fun. And so you love working out. And so you love working out and you go to the gym more. So loving to work out and going to the gym cause each other, right? We also have runaway, uncontrolled, change in one direction when you get injured. And now it is, you're not allowed, your PT program requires rest for a while. And so you haven't been to the gym. And so some of your key muscles are going to atrophy. And when you work out now, you are more prone to re-injury. And so being injured once and not being able to exercise effectively or efficiently can itself cause more injury, right? When we look at balancing effects, the first thing might grow and it causes the second thing to do something that stops growth. And so an example in the wildfire world is when you talk about a dry season makes more fire, but the fire then reduces the fuel load. And so having had a fire makes less fire. Less fire makes a fire that comes big, and the big fire makes no fire for a little while. And we see a longer balancing cycle when you take that same system, right? And you talk about a dry year, makes more fire, makes big fire. The fire clears out the fuel load. And now we've made space for, if there's a wet season, more undergrowth to grow. And so now the fuel load has really bloomed, literally, expanded significantly. And so now that you've had this wet season, you get this big fire. So you can look at they've eventually become, in a sufficiently big, complex system, you might be able to trace a feedback loop from one component through many, many, many that have a recursive effect back on the first. So If you've got a complicated system with a feedback loop, you can. Feedback loops exist in a complicated system. But where we see cause and effect become really problematic is when you've got a very, in principle, liking working out and exercising makes you like working out more. That's a pretty straightforward thing to understand. But you all know this when you're talking about prescribed burn or not, the question of unpredictability of weather, to be thinking about whether you want to cause fire to prevent fire is a problem that entails many, many, many actors and factors. So feedback loops are going to be at play. And if you've been thinking about some of the systems in your life that you've been recognizing are complex, you probably will find some feedback loops. A couple of other concepts that come up a lot that can be helpful to be able to talk about when you're thinking about problem solving and complexity is this notion of multiple equilibria is the fancy phrase. Systems, some of them tend to like to be in one of just a few states. And going back to the example of water, a system of water molecules is going to be either frozen, liquid, or gaseous. In my world, when we think about political science, you can talk about economies that tend to move from growth to stagnation versus economies that tend to be very irregular and never really settle down to one kind of state, right? You might have in your marriage, right? You might have periods where everything is just hunky-dory and then there's a trigger and for a while you're frustrated about something, but you're going to come back to that state where you remember why you were married, right? And now you're having a good time again. So as you think about the complex systems in your world, you might think about, do they tend to have just a few patterns that recur over and over again? And Chief Yancey offered earlier this week, it's like, it sounds like you're talking about my relationship with my county government and whether we are pro-public safety or focusing on other goals for a little while. We got talking about how in the public safety sphere, for a while, everyone's talking about interoperability, right? And police and fire need to be building skills, teams, and buying equipment together. But then we start to be focused on efficiency. And so now the police department and fire department aren't going to be coordinating quite as closely. And then they've purchased separate pieces of, separate communications tools that don't talk to each other anymore. And then suddenly everyone's mad when that makes for a challenge on a crisis scene. And now we're focused on interoperability again, right? So phase shifts where you've had the same conversation a couple of different times. And after you have the one, the other one's going to come up. You can be watchful when you are thinking about problem solving in complex systems for when you've shifted, had a phase shift from being in one of those regular states to suddenly being in the other. And this slide, this is one where if it makes sense to you right away, super duper. If it doesn't, no worries. There's going to be some examples that we'll talk about to this. But you'll hear this phrase nonlinear change for sure in the literature when you dig into complexity. And the idea here is that if a system is going to experience change, complex systems often evidence a pattern where that change happens at one rate for a while. It happens slowly for a while, and then suddenly it's going to go, the change will continue, but at a much different pace. In linear change, for every unit of time that passes, you have the same amount of growth, where from time 1 to time 2, I'm growing. And if you look from time 2 to time 3, I've had the same amount of increase in whatever this is. If you're looking, though, at a complex system, you might have a really steady process. You've been excited about, actually, we're going to go the other way. We're going to look at the second chart. Al was talking about drop off in recruitment, right? In the fire service over the past few years, you had a single recruitment plan. And for a long time, every year you were able to bring in the 40, 50 new recruits you wanted. And then suddenly COVID came. And every year you're doing the same recruitment, but now you're only getting 2 or 3 new people for each new class. You didn't change what you were doing, but there was a nonlinear change in how the system was behaving, right? you might see really weird patterns of stagnation, fast growth, and suddenly you think you're cool, you're going to roll with the whole new pace of change, and then it tops off again. It's all about, given the same amount of time or the same amount of input, the same amount of activity in a system, are you seeing the same kind of output, the same kind of behavior, or is there now a lot more or a lot less of what you had expected? This is a tremendous source of unpredictability. And related to this is this notion of path dependency. This is the last fancy word, the last key phrase I'm going to throw out here. Some of the changes that we see when complex systems move from one equilibrium or one state to another, some of the changes are almost always one way. Sometimes they are completely irreversible. And this is one of the phenomena that can make it really difficult for us when we're trying to think about how we're going to lead change in a complex system. You can't go back from, well, here too, the ecologists have done a lot of the work in this. Apparently, it's really, really hard to turn a desert into a forest. And this is what some of the people are talking with us about when we think about, are we going to go, are some of the changes that we might make or the changes that we don't do enough to prevent, are we going to make a problem for us that is really, really hard to come back from? So that all said, let's come back again to this notion of how do complex systems show up in your life, thinking again about what kind of components and interconnections you've got going on, how much diversity and adaptation you might see. Is cause and effect easy to understand or hard to discern? And be thinking about what the emergent properties are that are beautiful or frustrating in a complex system. And where you see feedback pattern, feedback loops, recurrence, nonlinear change, path dependency. I'm inclined, Al, to ask you to talk about that shift, that question of whether and when to take a fire department from all volunteer to include some career. Except I think you need to unmute.
Sorry, technology. Yeah, we had the conversation about the critical thinking piece and how we think differently about the challenges that we're facing. So the conversation led to how we transition our organizations. A lot of organizations today are dealing with the question of, is it time to move to some part-time people? Is it time to hire some career people? Falls into that complex system of how do we approach this as the call volume increases, the volunteerism may begin to fall off. We're in this mode in our country and really across the world of low levels of volunteer applications where people are not coming in the door like they used to, and continuing to do the same thing to try to recruit people. So we're trying to recruit people. That's not happening. So we make this decision about, is it time to go? Is it time to move into some partially paid and move to a combination department? And that becomes a very complex system of decision making, putting those groups together. As Kate talked about, the nonlinear change. Well, we've been doing this for a while. It's worked for a long time, but now it has not. However, now we're moving into something different. We're moving into hiring people. We're moving into a situation where sound decision making affects a lot of people, because now you hire people who have families, and those families are dependent upon the job potentially for career positions. So the idea of thinking critically and employing the right decision-making model is very critical in the fire service leadership side, especially as you begin to look at that transition phase. And BCOS, we spend a lot of time and offer a lot of resources to that transitioning piece. And here with this webinar and with this idea of thinking critically in all levels, really is pertinent to what's going on in the fire service today, as many departments are trying to figure out how do we protect our community when volunteerism is declining. We got to move to this level of some career people, but is it time, and how are we evaluating it? It's very complex.
And one of the things that we think about, and we got talking about earlier this week, is there's this feedback loop, right? Where, and I'll talked about, if the call volume goes up, or if the calls are really complex, it might turn off volunteers who have bandwidth to do the straightforward things, but don't have bandwidth to do the complicated, the really more burdensome calls, right? So if call volume goes up, or if calls are more difficult to handle, volunteers drop off, and so the remaining volunteer staff have even fewer people per call and have even fewer resources when they go into those difficult situations. And so even more of them fall off. So you have this vicious cycle, right? Where not having enough people to handle the workload means that you have even fewer people and the workload becomes even more unbearable. And when you marry that with the notion that the work you did, all the programs you put in place, following all the best practices to do recruitment, are less and less productive, you're thinking about, have I come to a tipping point? Is my system now moving from a functioning volunteer relationship with my community or to a dysfunctional relationship? Do I need to break the feedback loop? Do I need to get more people to make the calls more manageable? Or do I need to decide to become combination or career? But now, like Al was talking about, you've added whole new elements to your system. You need to have a health insurance plan, right? And so there's a whole new set of actors now that are in your system, and you've adapted from being one very different beast to another. And there's concern, right, about whether that is a one-way shift. If it turns out that your community can't sustain all the things that go into making a paid staff work, have you done so much to turn off your volunteers, or have you done so little of what you need to maintain that connectivity that you don't have them as a fallback option anymore? Or if you want to, it's a super interesting conversation. My husband runs a matrixed volunteer department, and these questions come up all the time.
Yeah, and to add to that complexity of what goes on when you move to that level, we could have a whole nother webinar, and have had other webinars on the complexity of moving to that, because the applications for career firefighters are down as well. So in a community that's transitioning to that, from volunteer to part-time or to career, in the days of where we used to see 70 applications, now we're seeing 7 in some cases, or it's dropped tremendously. So adds a whole new level of decision making of how do we work through this complexity now, because we made that decision to move to career, but we didn't get as many applications as we thought. We have this other piece that just creates that cycle of how you work through that decision.
Hey Kate, Michael M. Made a comment in the chat about the complexity of building fires. I was glad to see him mention that, because many times we don't think of a building fire as a complex situation, and they are complex. And what happens is when we don't recognize the complexity because we're not critically thinking, then we could have an injury and or a fatality. So,
well, and I actually was just going to call on that same comment, because this is something we talked about. No, it's something we've talked about every time this panel has talked about this webinar. It comes up when we think about the ways that we can think about a fire scene being complicated, or we can think about it being complex. Like that example of a single car crash into a tree, you can think about it as complicated, or you can think about it as complex. We got talking about how if you're looking at a single family home, and there's a whole house fire going on, and you think about your crew running up and they're going to put water on it. You can think about the house and the fire in it and the water as being part of a complicated system, where everyone knows if you put enough water on the fire, it's going to go out. Everyone thinks that there's this straightforward cause and effect. And we were thinking about, should we contrast that with, say, a multi-use strip mall facility, right? Where you've got a couple of now you've got more components. Before we were talking about a single family home, and maybe it's in the middle of the prairie, there's nothing around it. But if you've got this multi-use strip mall, you've got a bunch of different kinds of components. There are more of them. They are interconnected. either directly as part of a single structure or through, say, shared utilities or shared outbuildings they're partially connected to. And frankly, no fire is going to be only complicated. But what happens, say, if you're thinking about this multi-use system, multi-use facility, say one of the storefronts has some kind of hazardous or toxic material on site, and you came in and you thought you were going to put water on the fire and put out the fire, except the water floods a containment vessel, and now you've got a hazmat spill, and suddenly you've gone from having a straightforward fire to having the EPA needing to roll out. Or we were talking about, what if the strip mall is one that the community had wanted to redevelop? When you roll up on the single family home, you might have the intent of having a single straightforward goal of putting out the fire. But what if that multi-use facility is one that had been marked for demolition anyway, and it turns out
we've had that.
You have.
That is the Charleston Sofa Superstore fire. And
yes.
Way back, I know I'm talking history here. I have there will be a couple reports uploaded to the handout section that I've sent to Nan. But we had that at Charleston Sofa Superstore. But in 2001, Chief Brunacini in Phoenix, Arizona had a fatality. And what he said was, we were using residential tactics in a commercial structure.
Well, and where I want to go when I think about, because there is definitely a super important conversation to have about the alignment of the resources that we put to a single fire scene to make sure that we've got the right alignment of resources to the fire we're facing. And I am not an expert in that. There's a ton of training about how chief officers and scene commanders are going to make those choices. But Chief Buckman, you've raised a really great point. When we think about, when do you go from having the mission on scene to put out a fire to having the mission on scene to let it burn? And now your mission is to just contain extension. Or we got talking about, and also in the sofa fire, when do you go from having a plan of fire suppression? And this is something that Al and I had talked about too earlier this week. When you get an SOS, if one of your firefighters suddenly reports they're low on air, now your scene is not about fire suppression only. You've entered a path-dependent moment where you are now also in a respond and rescue, right? So you've shifted from being one thing to another, and the sofa fire definitely not only overwhelmed everyone's ability to respond on scene, but made people think really hard about what the job of the chief and the scene commander was in that moment, right?
Well, I think also, just briefly to say, well, you were talking about earlier about the balance between order and disorder, is that as the complexity grows in the incident and it becomes, you are much more in a balance of this becoming orderly or disorderly to chaotic. And as you add more of that, again, it's like this whole series or discussion is about applying the right decision-making processes, because as it gets more complex, you sit much more on that floating of it being under control or chaotic as to each decision that you make. So
yeah. And I'm inclined to just invite anyone at this moment to add anything else into the chat, that talking about where these feedback loops come in, where there's nonlinear change. I really have liked this example of all the ways those phenomena come to play when we think about managing volunteer recruitment versus thinking about combination or career management of a department. Where we talked about how you've got these feedback loops at play, you've got these recurring patterns where there's volunteerism for a while, and then there's all the fall off, and then maybe there's more volunteerism because something happens in the community that rallies people. But we have this concern, right, about what the emergent property of our fire department is. Is it functioning? Is it healthy? Is it growing? The emergent property of what our relationship is to our community. Are we mutually supportive? Are we sometimes at friction? All of these things come to play. And they definitely come to play in our microsystems, right? How do you relate to your staff? How do you relate to your local government officials? How do you relate to your family? as a parent or as a child or as a sibling. Give me one more second to sort of reflect on how this shows up in your life. I encourage you to take a minute to think about some area where complexity has been a challenge or a source of great energy for you, because we're going to turn now to problem solving and think about a couple of different strategies we might take. If you've got an idea of a complex system in your life, I encourage you to be thinking about how this next set of ideas applies in those circumstances every day. And we'll borrow words here from a book called Leadership on the Line that talks about the problems complicated systems present us as technical problems, and the problems that a complex system presents to us as being adaptive challenges or adaptive problems. On one hand, we've got clear solutions. In a complicated system, the brake system in your car, a mechanic knows exactly how to fix it. You might have to be more expert about brakes than I am, but someone who knows what they're doing can tell you exactly what you need to do to solve a problem in a complicated system. And we as leaders often are in a position to direct this. It's very straightforward. You tell your firefighters, go do these things, and it will put out the fire. When you're looking at, put out a very straightforward, simple fire. When you are looking at a complex system, a lot of the problems they present to us are problems without any clear solution, or there are many possible solutions, and the interconnectedness of the people means that multiple values, multiple interests, multiple concerns are at play. And any potential solution you offer is going to work or not work on the basis of a lot of other things that have to come together. Any solution is going to be ensnared in a lot of different elements that have to comply, contribute, buy into the solution, and execute it successfully. And a lot of the literature recommends that fundamentally then you can't just go in with a sense of, I'm going to send XYZ firefighter to go do this thing, or I'm going to go make this report to the committee and get the budget approval. You need to be thinking not just about your role and the different people in the role, but the whole system that you are all together, because the emergent property of success is what we're after here, right? And there's a writer whose work I really like, and she wrote dedicatedly to the everyday audience. She wants everyday readers to understand how they can succeed in making the change they want to see in a complex system. Her name is Donella Meadows, and she talks about 12 leverage points that exist for us when we want to make change in a complex system. And some are relatively easy, but they tend to have relatively little long-term or meaningful effect. So they are useful to us. And as we move down her list, we get into elements that are harder to affect, but those are the ones that have the biggest bang, that actually are going to make the change we want to see. So at the beginning of her list, the elements that we can change that are useful, but sometimes only a little bit effective or only partially effective, are to adjust rates of change. Say you do have sprinklers, fire sprinklers. They adjust the rate of spread of a fire in a facility, right? So if you want to change the complex system of number of fatalities in the US every year, one of the things you can do is make house fires, occupied building fires run slower. And you can do that by installing sprinklers. You can also adjust information flows as a general touch point that often is one we can make a good change to. It may or may not then end up making a change in the system we want. It tends not to, but this is to say, make more information about key elements more immediately available to the people that need it. And for example, there was an experiment that folks did in the Netherlands, in Northern Europe, about people spending on home heating. And what they discovered was that if the thermostat and energy meter in a home was in the basement, the occupants of the home used way more energy. if the energy meter, if your electric meter is in your front hall, they found people tended to use a lot less energy. So they've changed the way that information is available. And we've seen this too. We have this challenge when we're in a complex system, when you've got to get a team on board with a new decision. Sometimes you can do that by explaining to them information they didn't used to have. If someone's complaining about new training requirements that are being levied just when they thought they were all ready to take their technician's exam, and now there's this new requirement and they're really mad that this has disrupted their universe. And if you can explain why there's this new regulation or why the new requirement is going to help them succeed better as a technician and be more ready for the next promotion exams after that, helping them understand exactly what the information is about why this change has happened sometimes is useful. Or if the county keeps asking you to respond to more calls, maybe they have never seen how many of your folks are home with sick children, right? Sometimes a little bit more data can help you make the case. But like I say, those are levers that we quickly go to. There's going back to our previous comment about the difference between a technical and adaptive challenge. Those first levers are practical, right? We often feel like we understand how to get information to the hands of the people that need it, or ask people to spend a little bit more slowly on their budget in a given year. They feel very straightforward. They can be great tools for leaders and problem solvers. In this next set of activities that can make change and be more impactful, Meadows calls out that we can change how things are interconnected, not just through information, but through regular touches, regular meetings, making something that was far apart closer together. You can change the incentives people have to behave a certain way, pay them more, pay them less, offer them new opportunities, close opportunities they used to take instead of doing something that was more important. When you really want to make change, she argues, and a lot of other researchers have suggested, you have to fundamentally think about changing the goals and mindsets of the folks in a system. You need to think about getting people to believe that their system can do something entirely different and pursue an entirely different emergent property. And we'll have Chief McGee talk about one of those cases in a minute. To sum up the fundamental recommendations that people offer for those of us who need to lead change and make effective change in complex systems or steer a complex system successfully in a steady path, remember, you're going to be able to do the relatively straightforward but less impactful things of adjusting rates of change, changing what information people have. You can do the harder and more impactful work of changing how things are connected or introducing a whole new component into your system or changing an incentive for one set of actors to behave the way they do. Or you can do the really hard thing of changing how the system imagines what it's supposed to do, why it even is there. Observe and experiment. You will face questions, particularly in a large system that has a lot of moving parts. You are going to have to face the question of whether you're going to change all of the things or just one, just a few. This will change how many of those feedback loops you touch at a time. Sometimes it feels really compelling and can be very powerful to change just one thing, but sometimes to make the system do what you need it to do, you might need to change a lot of the parts of it because it's so deeply interconnected. You may need to do a lot of management of the expectations people have for how fast the system is going to change under your leadership and with their participation. You might need to encourage people to wait. They're really concerned about something that's happening now. And you know that one other component has to be in place before they can be effective. So lots of expectation management. And here too, this is something that'll come up in Chief McGee's example. And this is where you can tell I love talking about complexity. I think it is so relevant to our lives. And I think it presents really useful ways to think about the problems we face. And I come to this part in my introductory classes on complexity, and those of you who've seen Meadows' book, there's this part where you just have to say, and sorry, gang, sometimes what you want to do, even though you love this thing and you've thought really hard about it, sometimes your changes don't work. And it isn't because you are an idiot or that you had a bad idea. Sometimes it'll work and you don't even know why. And sometimes it doesn't work and you cannot figure out what happened. And that can feel really demoralizing and hard when you're in charge, right? And you might have a great plan that actually is going to work, but you have to wait for the system to change around you in one more way before it's going to happen. So this is where the observe, experiment, keep track, everything that you do that doesn't work may give you more information later to help you be really ready when you can be effective. And one of the things then that we'll leave you with is the notion that recognizing that if you are frustrated about failure, or if you are not entirely sure how to move forward, if you're not entirely sure which of these strategies to use, whether to make small changes in lots of places, whether to focus on shifting people's mindset about who they are, if you're not sure quite where to go, recognizing that you are in a complex situation can help you. Because Chief Buckman's already offered, if you're using the wrong set of tools, if you are using complicated tools, if you are using tools to address a technical challenge against an adaptive challenge in a complex context, you are, we think, way more likely to not get the outcomes you want. So we are hoping then that being aware of what complexity is and when you're facing a complex system can help you tune into the right kinds of ways to think about where you're going to find your problem and think about the team building and perspective on the whole that we think can help you get where you want to go. And I'm just seeing in the chat that a bunch of folks are grooving on the Meadows book. It's so great. But Chief McGee, I'm inclined to give you the floor then to talk about that illustration of when you were running the fire marshal's office, thinking about little changes you could make or thinking about those fundamental big purpose changes.
Thank you, Kate. When I was assigned as a fire marshal, one of the services that we provided was plans review and inspections for new development. And when I was assigned, it was like dropping into the crisis or the chaotic mode, where the development community were as angry as they could be with us because it took so long for us to review a plan. And then when we did review it, there was a large probability that was going to be rejected. In fact, we had an average of 3 plans reviewed. At least 2 or 3 would be rejected before we get the approval. So in looking at our approach, we were trying to find what was wrong, and it was the concept or a philosophy that we're an enforcement agency, and that's what our system was built around. That the developers were trying to get over on us as the regulatory agency, and that it was our job to find where they were tricking us. And so we had to do something fundamentally different if we were going to survive as a fire marshal's office. And so we worked on changing our philosophy from an enforcement agency to a compliance agency. And that involved talking to the customers, talking to the community, our elected officials, and going through a very participatory process with our staff to find everything that we could do to change our approach, considering that we have customers that are trying to do a compliant project. What can we do to help? And we were able to turn around a 90% rejection rate to a 90% approval rate over the course of several months. But one of the things that we had to do was to give ourselves some room, because one of the things that I shared with the county executive is what we're going to have to do to change this system is it's going to get worse before it gets better. And we needed for the county executive and the elected officials to give us that breathing room. It took about a month, but there was a lot of pressure. But once we started reaching out to the development community and getting their input, that's when we started to go into a new mode of of success.
And you said a couple of phrases, Kevin, that I really just are spot on from when we talk about these problems. We were trying to find out what was wrong. You knew that something was wrong.
Yes.
And I'm curious about how much did you look at the skill set? You know, if it turned out that each application ended up going through 3 rounds before it was done, did you look first at the applicants being idiots or your staff being overworked or thinking about whether you could change the workload?
That was the general thought. And as a matter of fact, the county executive approached me and said, look, I'll give you staff to help you get caught up. And my response was, I don't know if capacity is the issue or if the way we're doing business is the issue. And that's what it turned out to be. And we gave the freedom to let's experiment. If you have an idea, and everybody was given the responsibility of putting a new idea on the table. And we broke it down into what can we do short term, what's medium term, and what's long term. And it's like, we're going to start doing some of these changes immediately, and we're going to measure the kind of improvements we have. And one of the things we asked the clients, the development community, what are your expectations of us? So I'll give you one example. We prided ourselves on answering the phone by the 3rd ring. But that meant the plan reviewer had to stop what they're doing, address the phone, and then go back to pick up where they started from, which was very inefficient. And the developers told us, no, we don't, as long as we get an answer by the next day, we're good. You don't have to answer the phone every time. So that improved our efficiency. And we did a walkthrough plan review process where we were able to meet with developers. We did an education seminar for the development community on the top 10 things that cause a plan to be rejected. So we worked together to try to make the things better. And every initiative we did, we measured to see the impact, and virtually everything we did helped.
And here too, I'm hearing a ton that just as a complexity thinker has me so excited, because how many of you, when you're offered additional staff, you know, Kevin was talking about, our leadership came to us and said, yeah, we'll give you more people to help with throughput. How many of us would turn down more people? But this is exactly the kind of recommendation that when you know you're in a complex system, to pause and think, is that going to make things better, or might it even make things worse? You know, if you had one more person who was answering phone calls all the time instead of being able to work through each application, you might have ended up with an even more a slower and less successful rate of final review. And the other thing that you've talked about, which is just so great, is the notion of you first used the word participatory processes and reaching out to all of the stakeholders to make sure, because your staff wanted to succeed, but they also didn't want to have to work overtime or handle problems they weren't trained to do. Your developers, your applicants wanted to succeed. But they wanted to, you described this problem earlier in the year with me and talked about, they wanted to get their developments built. They had a really high incentive to have you guys move through their applications fast so that they could get their investments built. Yep. Everyone, though, it sounds like, agreed that shifting this notion of thinking about not being, oh, I gotcha, I'm going to show you where your development is no good, to channeling everyone's energy into making the system one of making sure that developments could go forward and be safe, that everyone did get on board with that. The other thing that I'll offer, though, that you've been talking about that I love when I think about complexity problem solving, you talked about doing a ton of different things. And what a lovely list of changes that you were able to make with all different kinds of components in the system. You've talked about measuring every single one of them and being able to show that they were all effective. For what it's worth, sometimes it can be really hard to show whether one particular change made all the difference or even made any difference. If you're changing all the things all the time, like, I wonder, Kevin, if you can talk about the different measures of effectiveness and contribution you were making. So it sounds like there's some customer satisfaction things, staff satisfaction that was going on, but fundamentally, could you say that all the changes you made, could you point to directly how they improved output?
Sure. I'll give you one example, and that was the walkthrough plan review process. So our goal, and this was not a good goal, as I was coming into the fire marshal's office, was to get a plan review turned around within 30 days. Well, it was taking us 90 days. Well, there's probably 40% of the plans that are very simple ones. So when we did a walkthrough plan review process, the designer can come right in, meet with the plan reviewer, and there might be one thing wrong with it that would have caused it to be rejected. First of all, they're able to come in like the same day. But secondly, if there was that couple things that were a problem that would have caused rejection, the plan reviewer can say, well, if you move the sprinkler head over here and you forgot to do something over here, that designer could make the change right there and get us an approval stamp. And so we were able to segment the different types of plans we had. Another example would be where we had pre-construction meetings with the large projects, where we would go over with the designer and the architect and the contractor the things that we see as causing problems, and they explain what their project entailed, and we pointed them in the right direction to make sure they had the right resources to get a good plan that could be approved on the first submission. So all those kind of things we measured if it was working in segments, I would say.
And when I think about how this is a great case study, the thought experiment is, if you had only done the one education session, if you had only done the education session, or if you had only identified that you wanted to do walkthrough, these pre-consultative walkthroughs, or if you had only identified that you needed to allow your staff not to answer the phone, would any one of those interventions by themselves have been as effective as when you did them all at once? Could you maybe have made the change you wanted by doing only two of those things instead of all three? It's a really, really, really great example of, when you are a leader, which of those hard things do you defend doing? Which of the simple things do you double down on because it's simple and it is doing at least something that's good? It can be really hard to discern that. And I love that you've had success in that case, Kevin.
Well, I'll tell you why we couldn't have done just one or two of those things, even if it would have made a big difference. Because as we engaged the staff, and when I came in, they were quite stressed and demoralized because the development community was not happy with them. They were stressed with their workload. And then when they were able to engage in giving possible solutions, and we're willing to say, let's give it a try, that was very motivating. And if we had the mindset of, we're just going to do one or two things and see how it works, I don't think that we could have turned the satisfaction level of the staff around the way we did, when it's like, you guys, you are all part of the solution, and we need every single member of this team to submit ideas that we could try.
And what do you do if some of the ideas are lousy, right? Sometimes that happens. And so figuring out how to maneuver that.
Well, we started
ways to make that work if you have to. Mm-hmm. But it sounds like you had a great team.
We didn't we did the brainstorming model where everybody gets their chance to give their input without judgment. And then we categorized it into these short-term, medium-term, long-term. And as a group, we decided, here are the things we're going to do first. Frankly, I can't tell you what we would have done with a bad idea because we didn't get one.
I'm inclined, and it's such a, and part of why I like ending here is that it is a win. Like, even if the slide notes that sometimes it doesn't work, I love that there's this great illustration that sometimes it does. So before we close, Landon, have you got something else to throw in from the chat?
I was going to say from Derek, we had a question in the Q&A about transitioning organizational posture from single role to multi-role personnel, and I thought maybe we'd hit that real quick before we wrap.
Is that one you want to talk to?
Maybe we all can. So the question, if y'all want to open up your Q&A, is just how do we transition from a single role to the multi-role personnel to counter reduction in the talent pool? Whew. Yeah, man, you're talking about, this is a really complex problem. While ensuring you're not forcing people out of positions who are maybe not able to make that mid-career pivot. And I mean, I think I kind of want to point a little bit to what Chief McGee was talking about, is sometimes these complex changes happen slowly and methodically and systematically, and you have to pull apart the pieces so that you can change them. What I always tell people is that your organizational culture is like an ice block, and it's got a bunch of floaties in there. And if you want to change where the floaties are or what the floaties are, you have to thaw it piece by piece and change it. And you can do that by breaking it apart, but you'll get the corresponding mess. So I don't know if any of the other chiefs want to weigh in on it. Al, you're muted.
I'll get this right eventually. I think it's a great analysis of it. I think in the model of what we're talking about for sure is that taking your time to analyze the priorities and look at the situation of what your community is facing and how do you develop into that, in terms of, I'm looking at the question here, you have to be mindful of that concept and idea of not forcing people out of positions who are in their mid-career. And you got to look at, how do we utilize the historical knowledge of these people who've been with your community for a long time and get the input like Kevin's talking about with his model, having input, feedback, and those kind of things to make the right decision for your community and for your organization to transition. Like I said earlier, we could do a whole, and have done other webinars and have programs available to be able to talk about how you do some of that transitioning. But just careful problem solving, whether within that is, as Kate talked about, is adaptive challenge or is a technical challenge. There's going to be both in this transition to combination or career.
Yeah, and I'd add just a little bit to that briefly, that borrowing again from Heifetz and Linsky, the real question is not what we're changing, but what are people losing when you're looking at that. And in many cases, if you take the time to analyze it, you can make sure they don't lose it, because it might be that those people who are in that mid-career pivot don't mind learning new skills, but they're worried about losing their seniority or the prestige that comes with being at the top of that hierarchy, or some other social component of their roles. And you may be able to preserve that for them in a positive way if you identify it.
Yeah,
and I think it takes a lot of dialogue, and that's a process that I've been through in my department, that where we engaged in dialogue for years. And it's not like the fire marshal case where we had to make a rapid change, but it was an incremental approach where how do we advance in a way where it's a win-win-win, as opposed to the Marty Linsky leadership on the line, where people, what are they concerned about losing, and how do we avoid not having that happen?
And Great illustrations. I know we're about to run out of time. One thing I'll offer is that if we go back to this framework we've talked about today, a core question here is adaptation, right? What are the components that have to change into something they haven't been? And I really love these framings about how we help someone see that I'm not asking you to stop being what you were, which was a lieutenant. I'm asking you to stop being a single skill lieutenant and become able to be a bigger mentor and serve with a different kind of role in our community. And lots of talk may need to go into that. But looking at our framework, we're thinking here about understanding what components we are changing, how far we're asking them to adapt. And to Kevin's point about talking a lot about why we're doing that can help people understand that we are doing this not to punish people, but to become more effective at a job we love.
Yeah, changes like this are highly emotional. I think you have to recognize, and Chief Buckman could probably talk about that for hours, but it's, these type of changes to go, changing roles, the community in and of itself. I live in a community that has been changing, going through change and growth, and at periods of time are rapid growth to times where it's a little steadier. And within those changes, it's highly emotional for everyone. The community, people who've lived in the community for a long time, the organization who's been rooted in a certain type of mode. It's a very emotional thing that includes stepping through that carefully. And Landon brought that up in terms of the ice cube. Like, how do you dissect that? How do you look at each component? And how do you address each one to get through the transition?
It's a great question, though. And we'd love to continue engaging with any of you who have examples of questions like this that our community might be able to help each other solve when we take the system approach.
Well, let me jump in here and say, wow. I got to believe I haven't seen anybody leave that was in the chat section. So I'm sure many of them are sweating, because they're just trying to take all this stuff in, and their brain's got to be just running at 150 miles an hour. So I hope that those who are in attendance agree with my analysis of what information has been shared with you today, and how we're going to, V2S is going to continue to work on figuring out how we can share more about this with the fire service and help them make better decisions for their people, for their firefighters, their residents, and for their government. So with that, I'm going to say we're going to wrap it up for today. Thank our 4 presenters for coming on here and giving up their time. This has been recorded, so those of you that maybe have friends that you think missed it, we always have some people who don't make it to the live session, so we know that we have people go looking at the recording. I encourage you to use this in a variety of ways. Staff meetings, training sessions, so on and so forth. It is, you can do it for free, no charge. So with that, we will say thank you very much. We appreciate everybody attending this afternoon, and take care and be safe out there.
Bye-bye.
Take care, y'all.